Paris in the summer of 1794 was a city drowning in its own fear. At the center of the storm stood one man, Maximilien Robespierre, the so-called incorruptible architect of the Reign of Terror. History remembers his fall as a moment of revolutionary justice, a clean end for a brutal ruler, but the truth is far darker and more visceral. By the end of this story, you will know the shocking, agonizing reality of Robespierre's final hours, a sequence of events so brutal it challenges everything we assume about his downfall. What really happened when the master of the guillotine was forced to face his own creation? How could a system designed for clinical efficiency deliver such a horrific and botched execution? The answers lie in a tale of shattered bone, failed suicide, and a revenge that was anything but swift. What does it mean when the architect of terror becomes its most tortured victim? His power was absolute, but his body was a fragile vessel for such immense control. Robespierre was a man of contradictions, a revolutionary who dressed like an aristocrat from the previous century, a voice of the people who lived in austere isolation. He believed with a fanatic's certainty that the Republic could only be purified through what he called virtue, and its necessary companion, terror. To him, these were not opposites but two sides of the same coin. Virtue was the ideal citizen, selfless and devoted to the nation. Terror was the swift, merciless blade that carved away anyone who failed to meet that impossible standard. He saw conspiracies in every shadow, enemies in every whispered conversation. This mindset made him the perfect leader for the Committee of Public Safety, a small group that had effectively become the government of France during its most desperate crisis. From a cramped office, Robespierre and his colleagues signed orders that decided life and death for thousands. The system they built was chilling in its bureaucratic efficiency. Arrests were made based on denunciations, trials were swift and offered little defense, and the sentence was almost always the same. Then came the sound that defined Paris in those months. It started in the morning, the rumble of wooden wheels on cobblestones as the tumbrils, those open carts, rolled through the streets. They carried the condemned on their final journey, past silent crowds, to the city's squares. And there waited the national razor, the guillotine. It was a machine designed for equality in death, a clinical and supposedly humane end. Its blade fell with a terrible, metallic finality, a sound that echoed through the city day after day. Robespierre was the architect of this entire terrifying apparatus. He justified every drop of blood spilled as the necessary price for saving the revolution from itself. He believed he was building a new world, even as he drowned the old one in fear. He never once considered that the machinery of terror, once set in motion, could not be controlled. He never imagined that the same citizens who flinched at the sound of the tumbrils, the same politicians who voted for his every decree, might one day decide that the greatest enemy of the revolution was the man who claimed to be its purest defender. The very system he created to protect the Republic was, in the end, a trap he had built for himself, and when the spring finally snapped shut, it would not deliver the clean, efficient death the guillotine promised. Instead, it would deliver something far more personal and far more cruel. The tension finally snapped on the 9th of Thermidor, a date burned into history as July 27, 1794. In the National Convention, the same hall where Robespierre had once commanded silence with a glance, his enemies found their courage. They shouted him down, their voices a wall of accusation, denying him the right to speak. The very man who had declared so many others outside the law was now, in a stunning reversal, declared an outlaw himself. This meant he could be arrested and executed without a trial, a brutal piece of his own legal machinery now turned against him. In a state of shock, Robespierre fled with his closest allies, seeking refuge at the Paris City Hall, the Hôtel de Ville. There he tried to rally the city's radical government, the Commune, to rise up in his defense. For hours, confusion reigned. Proclamations were written, messengers sent, but the people of Paris, exhausted by terror, did not flood into the streets to save him. The momentum had irrevocably shifted. As midnight approached, the forces loyal to the convention surrounded the building. Inside, the room was lit by the flickering glow of oil lamps, the air thick with desperation. The sound of boots on the stairs echoed through the corridors. It was in this moment, with capture imminent, that Robespierre reached for a pistol. He placed the barrel under his chin and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out in the confined space, but it was not the clean end he may have sought. The ball struck at an angle, tearing through his lower face in a catastrophic wound. It shattered his jaw, a brutal injury that was agonizingly survivable. When the soldiers burst into the room, they did not find a defiant leader. They found a man slumped in a wooden chair, his once impeccable blue coat soaked in blood. His jaw was essentially destroyed, hanging loose and shattered. He was conscious, trapped in a world of excruciating pain, and utterly unable to speak. The architect of the terror, the voice that had commanded a nation, was now reduced to a silent, bleeding figure, his power gone, his body broken. He was no longer a tyrant to be feared, but a helpless victim to be paraded. And his ordeal, the true horror of his execution, had only just begun. The silence that now enveloped Robespierre was not one of power, but of profound helplessness. His shattered jaw meant he could not protest, could not defend himself, could not even beg for water. The soldiers who had captured him fashioned a crude litter, likely a door torn from its hinges, and carried him out into the night. They were not gentle. Every jolt as they descended the stone stairs of the city hall sent fresh waves of agony through his face. The journey to his prison cell was a public spectacle in the making, a preview of the humiliation to come. He was deposited in a holding room, a temporary stop before being transferred to the conciergerie, the antechamber to the guillotine, known as the last stop for so many of his own victims. There a doctor was summoned. The medical care was minimal, a brutal necessity rather than an act of mercy. His jaw was crudely bandaged with blood-soaked linen, a dressing that did little to stabilize the broken bone or alleviate the searing pain. He could not swallow properly. He was likely fed thin broth or wine, which he would have had to laboriously let trickle down his throat. This was a long, dark night of silent suffering, a stark contrast to the thunderous speeches that had once filled the halls of power. The next day, the formalities of his destruction were executed with chilling speed. He was brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal for a trial that was a mere parody of justice. With his mouth bound by bandages and bone, he could offer no defense. The prosecutor simply recited the decree of outlawry. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Condemned to death, he was scheduled for execution that very afternoon, a swift efficiency he himself had championed, but the final journey from his cell to the scaffold was designed to maximize his torment. He was loaded not onto a proper tumbril with other prisoners for some grim camaraderie, but onto a simple, open cart used for hauling manure. This was a deliberate insult, a reduction of the incorruptible to refuse. The cart's wooden wheels hit every stone and rut in the Paris streets. For a man with a freshly shattered jaw, each bump was a small explosion of pain, jolting the damaged bone with relentless cruelty. The route to the Place de la Révolution was lined with a crowd unlike any other. These were not the silent, fearful citizens of the Terror. This was a mob unleashed, vengeful and jubilant. They shouted insults, their voices a torrent of hatred. They threw more than words. Rotten fruit, stones, and clods of mud rained down upon the broken figure in the cart. For hours, Robespierre had to endure this gauntlet of public rage, unable to look away, unable to respond, the bloody bandage around his face a stark banner of his defeat. He was forced to witness the sheer, visceral hatred of the very people he had claimed to save, a living portrait of a revolution devouring its creator. This procession was not just a trip to an execution, it was a prolonged and brutal ceremony of undoing, stripping him of every last shred of dignity before he ever reached the blade. The guillotine awaited him in the sunlit square, a machine he had endorsed as an instrument of enlightened mercy, but on that afternoon it would deliver anything but. When the cart finally halted at the foot of the scaffold, the executioner, Charles Henry Sanson, faced a grim and unprecedented problem. Robespierre was half-conscious, slumped against the cart's side, his face a mask of crusted blood and soiled linen. The first step in the ritual was to remove the prisoner's coat and cut his collar, but Robespierre's bandage was in the way. Sanson had to peel the stiff, blood-soaked cloth from the ruined flesh beneath. This was not a gentle medical procedure. It was a violent, necessary act, likely tearing at the clotted wound and the shattered bone fragments, sending fresh, searing pain through the condemned man's body in the final moments of his life. Then came the true malfunction of this merciless machine. The guillotine's efficiency depended on perfect alignment. The prisoner's neck had to be placed securely in the curved wooden block called the lunette, which then locked into place, holding the head perfectly still for the falling blade. But Robespierre's jaw was destroyed. He could not close his mouth, could not rest his chin properly on the edge of the block. His head lolled at a grotesque, unnatural angle. Witnesses described a frantic struggle. Sanson and his assistants would have had to physically manhandle Robespierre's head, forcing it down into position, likely yanking it by the hair or pressing brutally on his shoulders. Even then, the fit was poor, the angle was wrong. When the rope was released and the heavy blade rushed down its grooves, it did not meet its target with the clean, surgical precision its designers had promised. Instead, historians and medical experts who have studied the accounts suggest a far more horrific possibility. The blade likely struck the lower jaw first, the very site of his gunshot wound, before continuing its terrible descent. This would not have been an instant cessation of life. It could have meant a partial or messy decapitation, a catastrophic injury that may have left Robespierre conscious for one or two more agonizing heartbeats of incomprehensible pain. The machine built for a swift and equal death, the very symbol of the terror he orchestrated, betrayed him at the last possible second. The master of the guillotine did not receive its cold mercy. He received its raw, mechanical failure, a final cruel irony written in steel and bone. His final moments were not a clean execution, but a prolonged and agonizing collapse. The man who had perfected a system of terror died at its broken hands, a victim of its very imperfections. Robespierre's story is a chilling lesson in how the machinery of violence, once built, cannot be finely controlled. He designed a process meant to be swift and impersonal, a bureaucratic solution to the problem of enemies, yet his own end was intensely personal, messy, and filled with a raw, physical suffering he never intended for anyone. It forces us to confront a difficult historical mystery. Was this horrific sequence of events simply a tragic accident, a confluence of a botched suicide and a malfunctioning machine? Or was it a form of cosmic justice, a brutal poetic retribution for the thousands who endured that same cart ride and faced that same blade without mercy? The debate continues because the symbolism is so potent. Does knowing the gruesome, intimate details of his death change our understanding of the reign of terror? Does it make the period more human or more horrifying? It reminds us that history's grand narratives of revolution and ideology are ultimately made of flesh and bone, of pain and fear. It asks us to consider whether violence, even in the pursuit of a new world, inevitably corrupts the very justice it seeks to create. What do you think? Was Robespierre's fate deserved, or was it a final, terrible symptom of the system he built? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and tell us which other dark chapters of history you'd like us to explore. Subscribe and join us for more deep dives into the moments where the past reveals its most complex and haunting truths.